So welcome everybody. You are on the Pollution Knows No Borders webinar with Pure Earth, Rachel's Network, and HEFN. Today's presentation is going to be done by Richard Fuller, President of Pure Earth, Drew McCartor, Pure Earth's Regional Director of South Asia, Lara Crampe, Pure Earth's Director of Community Outreach, and Judith St. Pure Earth's Regional Director of Africa. And I'm just going to take a quick word about the two other organizations kind of co-hosting today. Rachel's Network, named for Rachel Carlson, is a community of women at the intersection of environmental advocacy, philanthropy, and leadership. Our mission is to promote women as impassioned leaders and agents of change dedicated to the stewardship of the earth. You can find out more about our organization at rachelsnetwork.org. And HEFN, the Health and Environmental Funders Network, is a network of foundations, donors, and philanthropic advisors whose mission is to mobilize philanthropy to accelerate solutions for environmental health and justice problems. HEFN is advancing solutions-focused strategies, building funder and field leadership, and expanding investment. And you can learn more about HEFN at HEFN, HEFN.org. To speak more about Pure Earth and start our presentation, I'm going to turn things over to Richard Fuller.
Thank you, Jamie. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Really thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having us. It's always been great to be connected with HEFN and Rachel's Network over the last few years. What I want to do today for the first 15 minutes and then turn it over to the other parts of my team is give you a background on an issue that's central to our operational work, which is pollution and health. And we're concerned about toxins impacting people's health in many different ways. And we do this through Pure Earth in a work that's really focused on implementing solutions. We're an organization based in New York, but with offices in 8 or 9 other countries, and activities going on in roughly 50 countries at the moment, all in low and middle income locations. So Mexico, Indonesia, Philippines, and so on. And we're mostly implementing programs that are reducing mortality and morbidity, stopping people from dying or getting sick from being exposed to pollution of different types. Our main focus has been around chemicals and soil pollution, but we work also in areas related to air pollution, especially any kind of pollution that's come about because of the growth of industrialization in low and middle income countries. Aside from doing a lot of program work, and just for those to understand how big we are, our spend is around $5 million a year. About 2/3 of our budget comes from people like USAID or the European Commission or World Bank. And the balance comes from private philanthropic foundations and individuals. So doing this work internationally has been successful and interesting, but hasn't gone to the scale that needs to be. And so we've been also working on advocacy in that way. So we've been behind many different reports. The most significant is the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health. And I worked with Dr. Philip Landrigan as co-chairs to this particular report that many of you may have seen. It came out a couple of years ago in Lancet. And let me give you a few of the key findings from that report as kind of a basic starting point for this discussion. The first and main key finding is that pollution is actually the largest cause of death in the world. When you look at deaths from air and water and sanitation and chemicals and add them all up, it's 16% of all deaths, 9 million deaths a year. And that's bigger than any other individual major public health risk. It's 3 times bigger than HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. It's bigger than road accidents. You know, we're all very worried right now about drugs and OxyContin and all the rest of it. It's far, far bigger than that and alcohol combined. And tobacco, which has traditionally been the largest WHO agenda item for environmental issues, it is larger than that. This data is from 2015. We've recently updated that data from 2017 data, and the numbers still remain high, and in fact, some areas, especially the chemicals aspect of pollution, are growing substantially. Most of this disease is not in our backyards. It's in low and middle income countries. And so in some of these countries, you can see the redder countries here are the ones that are most affected. In some of them, 1 in 4 deaths are directly attributable to exposure to some kind of toxin. So India and Africa, Southeast Asia are substantially impaired because of what's being put out into their air and water and soil in different ways. And I'll talk in a bit more detail about those, what specific toxins are doing what sort of damage. And then the team will talk about how we're fixing those exposures and stopping those exposures getting out into the world and then getting into the bodies of the people we worry about. And the people we worry about most are our kids. These kids around the world are exposed to toxins in much more substantive fashion than an adult. Because they're so small, but the toxins still have the same concentration in whatever they're breathing or drinking as adults, they get more of it per kilogram, if you like, of body mass. So it impacts them more. That, and also the slow, steady development of the brain and so many toxins that affect brain fetal development in brains and in the first 5 or 10 years. These are enormous impacts that occur for children from toxins around the world. And of course, it's not then just kids, but it's girls, it's pregnant women, nursing women. Most of the heavy metals will pass across the placental boundary. And many of these toxins also will show up in breast milk and then pass into kids in breast milk. And the implications overall are extraordinary. Not just in terms of disease, but also neurological damage, impaired intelligence, and developmental disabilities and developmental issues in general. So it's a problem of scale, but let me show you how big that scale is and how it's been going over the years. So this chart from Lancet looks at deaths and how they've been changing over the years for 2 different types of pollution. The blue line is the pollution that's caused by industrialization. It's that modern aspect of pollution that comes about because all of these countries are growing substantially. They're building industries on the edges of their cities. The cities are then growing themselves over those toxic sites. Other industries grow up further on, and this continued kind of growth ends up with a lot of toxicity throughout those cities as they grow. So the chemicals, soil, and ambient air pollution numbers are rising year to year. Now, in the other side of pollution is the pollution that's a function of poverty. And that part of it is sanitation and indoor cook stoves. So as more money is available within households for them to have better sanitation and to have better cooking, those deaths are reducing. So the orange chart is the traditional poverty-based pollution issues, and the blue chart is the stuff we worry about, which is to do with industry and urbanization. For the economists amongst us, pollution is a drain on economic growth and GDP in general. When we do the numbers in terms of mortality and morbidity, that 9 million premature deaths that we showed before, we can find in low and middle income countries that's actually costing 2% of GDP simply because of lost productivity. So that calculation comes about by looking at people who are dying before they should, while they're still able to work, or being too sick to be able to work because of pollution exposures. And looking at that actual incremental cost, it ends up being around 2% of GDP in those countries. And a minimum of 7% of healthcare costs are associated with the pollution as well. And when we use another economic metric, welfare costs, the number is even larger. It's overall, it's in the trillions of dollars and 6% of global GDP. So I hope I painted a picture that shows an enormous exposure to all kinds of different toxins out there, mostly in low and middle income countries. I think the question for all of this is, how much of that is impacting us? And this question came up for us a couple of years ago, and we spent quite a lot of time researching and developing a report on this, looking at how toxins internationally move around the globe and end up impacting us directly here in our own homes here in the US or Europe or the West. And this is, the results of this analysis were really quite disturbing. There are two major ways that toxins that are being generated in the poorer countries end up coming back and impacting us here. The first is air pollution. Now, the main pollutant we worry about in air is little particles that go into the lungs, and then they cause cardiovascular disease and lung cancer. They're called PM 2.5. The size of the particle is measured in microns, 2.5 microns or less in size. And we can measure concentrations of PM 2.5 all around the world. And in fact, if you go to one of our websites, pollution.org, you can see those measurements taken from all sorts of different sources for places all around the world. When we look at the particulates in the Bay region in San Francisco, analysis can show that more than a third of them are actually coming from China. When they look at air pollution events in Paris and London, when the large air pollution events occur that make the news here, it's always because there's been a lot of crop burning going on in Eastern Europe or the Ukraine. And those particulates go up in the air and then move west and swirl around and cause those significant events. So burning in one place doesn't mean it stays there. It follows the winds and moves place to place. The second issue that's of concern is the food supply. This was really an extraordinary finding to note that we really are a global economy, and we're buying food on our tables from all over the world. And yet, in many places, the food is not produced to a standard that we would really like to see. And we're finding many farming areas, many regions, especially in India and China, that are using wastewater from industry to water their crops. They're forced to do this because climate change has reduced groundwater levels for water tables, so they can't pump water. And there's so much population pressure that they have to go to whatever water source they can. And when we look at reports over the last decade of concentrations of toxins in, first of all, grains, rice and wheat, and secondly, in baby formula with some of the rice there, and even in chocolate, we're seeing a steady increase of samples failing our own standards with lead, with chromium, with arsenic, with pesticides, and with antibiotic residues. So I'll give you one kind of disturbing example of that. This is a rather weird photo of a fish being inspected by FDA. I'm not sure which end his head is, but I hope it's the other end. In 2015, the last time the FDA produced a report, as you can imagine, they showed that they're testing only 0.1% of fish imports into the US. By the way, of all the fish that we buy in and consume, 80+% of it's coming from overseas. We import by far and away the majority of our fish from overseas. And this is everyone, it's Whole Foods all the way down and on. Of that 0.1% that they actually checked, they rejected 9% of it for having heavy metals or toxins or other kinds of materials in here. Now, the other 99.9% they didn't check. Now, when we go in and look at what levels the toxins were there, they weren't ever such worrisome levels that I would be concerned immediately. But if you're eating it every day, I'd be concerned. They were there sometimes just above the FDA standards. But what is worrying is that if you look over time and how much these toxins are showing up in our foodstuffs, it's growing rapidly. And it tells me that we need to go and deal with this at source. We can't rely on dealing with toxic exposures just by dealing with domestic issues. If we're going to deal with the next set of toxic exposures, it has to be done by looking at where most of these toxins are being created. So I want to give you a little bit of detail on that by looking at one specific toxin, which is lead. Now, we all know about lead from Flint and now from Newark. It's an enormous problem overseas. And we just had a wonderful afternoon with the New York City Department of Health team who's responsible for lead in New York City. And now, more than before, it's not just lead in paint that they see as the source of the exposure when kids show up with high blood lead levels. It used to be that it was 80% was lead in paint. Now that number is dropping, and most of the exposures now are beginning to be lead in spices, lead in candies that are being imported, lead in products that are coming from overseas. By the way, well, I'll let Drew talk more about lead in spices, but we want to watch out. Turmeric often has a lot of lead in it because it's yellow, and lead yellow is a cheap, inexpensive additive to make it heavier and brighter. So turmeric is a worrisome thing. Similarly also, what's the other one? Paprika is another one we need to worry about because that also is red, and that's another issue to be concerned about. To talk about lead from an analytical perspective, not many people know, but lead right now by WHO is responsible for more than 1 million premature deaths a year. So to put that in perspective, HIV is less than that. Malaria is 620,000. All war and terrorism is 140,000 deaths per year. Lead is on its own one of the most extraordinary issues. Those deaths are because lead not only causes intellectual impairment and reduction of damages brains for developing children, but it also hardens arteries in the same way that smoking does and causes an increase in cardiovascular risk. And most of these deaths are because people will get heart attacks in their 40s and 50s and not go all the way to, 80 that they should. And lead is now one of the largest cardiovascular risks out there. And we've underestimated it substantially in terms of its extraordinary result because we got rid of lead in gasoline and thought it was all dealt with. Well, as we look deeper and further, it's not from gasoline anymore, it's from battery recycling. And while in the US, we recycle our batteries very well and there's no exposures and no one gets sick, that doesn't happen overseas, where more than half of the batteries in many countries are recycled illegally in backyards, where they smash open the batteries, pull out the lead and melt it, and that lead spreads through their own communities. There's other exposures too with lead in ceramics, where ceramic bowls are lined with lead. And cookware also has lead in it. It's in spices, in cosmetics, all sorts of different places. But 80% of it starts with cars and motorcycles and the battery that every single one of them has to have. Now, this is a scene in Vietnam. Everyone needs transport and there is a boom in vehicle ownership going on. And every single one of these cars has a lead acid battery in it. More than 80% of all lead consumption is actually going into car batteries or scooter batteries or bus batteries. And even electric cars need to have one of these batteries. So there isn't an alternate. They're not going away. What we need to do is we need to help those countries that aren't recycling the way we are here in the US to get up to that standard and stop these exposures from going on. So let me step back from here a little bit and talk about the solutions to this particular problem. As you can see, it's a substantial problem. And we've been doing this now for 20 years in countries all around the world, in every region. And we now have a pretty good sense of what needs to happen country by country. because the issues need to be taken up by those countries as part of their own development strategies. And our role here in the West is to bring the right amount of intelligence and capability and training and knowledge to countries and their own government agencies so they can become adept at dealing with these issues in the same way that we already have here, mostly in the West. And we do that first by identifying where the toxic issues are occurring, and then working out what needs to change in industry, what needs to become cleaner and better, showing how to do that with pilot projects, and then providing support and assistance for the long-term funding and technologies that are needed to be able to make these places safe and clean, and therefore to make our own resources that come back to us safe and clean as well. And a lot of this needs a lot of science and a lot of advocacy work around it. And we've been doing that now for quite a amount of time. Just as one example, here is a data set of over 5,000 highly contaminated sites. These are all places that are worse than Love Canal. We haven't done this in every country, but in about 50 countries to date. And you can see arsenic, chromium, mercury, pesticides, cadmium, all kinds of toxins are showing up at high levels of toxication. So what I'd like to do now is ask my team to show you some of the key ways that we've seen work in order to be able to stop these toxins from being put out into the environment and damaging local kids. And we'll do that by looking at lead, which is really the biggest one out there right now. And then mercury, which has an extraordinary parallel impact with us because it's associated with gold. And then quite importantly, something rather boring but absolutely critical, which is the planning processes that need to happen to help countries understand the size and the scope of this issue and how to be able to make it a priority within their own budgets and development processes. So with that, let me turn it first over to Drew McCartor, who's in Seattle. And I hope we can make that transition smoothly. And let's see how we go.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rich. My name is Drew, and I have run Pure Earth's programs in a variety of regions over the world, but currently Southeast Asia. And through that work have run into a lot of issues around lead. So I'd like to jump into some of the specifics of the challenges around lead, but then more importantly, some of the solutions that we and others that work on this issue have identified. So as Rich noted, in the US and other high-income countries, we're aware of lead because of its presence in old paint and perhaps old pipes. But those really aren't the sources of lead that are driving exposures in lower income countries. So I'd like to talk about some of those sources that we've identified in all of our field work. And the first one, as Rich mentioned, is batteries. The type of battery that we're looking at, the industry term is lead acid batteries. Most people would just call them car batteries. And as Rich said, they not only are in every sort of automobile, but in countries where the electricity supply is interrupted occasionally, these are also found in homes and businesses so that people can have backup power storage and uninterrupted supply. So we'll get into that in a minute, but then also, as Rich noted, there are types of cookware that are not very common in high-income countries, but are more prevalent in low-income countries. And when you use them, they have lead in them that can leach into your food and then into the body, of course. And then finally, an emerging issue that we and others are learning more about every day, and that is adulterated spices. This one is limited to specific geographies, which we'll touch on in a minute. So let's have a look at batteries. What's the problem with batteries? So a lead acid battery is not problematic in itself per se. All of the economies around the world really rely on the use of lead acid batteries. And they can be quite a safe product to manufacture and recycle if done correctly. The problem is in lower income countries, upwards of 50% of these batteries are actually recycled in the informal economy, in operations that are not licensed, that don't pay taxes, and are essentially not regulated by any authorities. And unfortunately, this practice, this very kind of crude recycling practice, takes place in residential areas where not only the workers that dismantle these batteries are exposed, but the lead that's released through this product goes up as dust and spreads around these residential areas and poisons kids. Now, this is a challenging issue to address in some respects because it's a subsistence livelihood. The lead in these batteries is valuable, and the people that are doing this recycling are generally uneducated about the risks of lead and are really doing this activity out of survival. And a further challenge is that the regulatory authorities that are in charge of addressing this or preventing this often are themselves not that well educated about this issue. So if they see this type of activity, they don't have the training to identify what is a safe facility or what is a dangerous facility, or how to give technical guidance to these operators to make sure that they are running clean operations. So fortunately, there are fairly simple solutions at hand that we and others have used around the world that have been proven successful. And the first set of those is to really understand the problem, because the problem varies from country to country. Sources of lead in the Republic of Georgia might be different than those of India, than those of Indonesia. So the first step is to identify and assess pollution hotspots, as Rich mentioned, which is something that we and others do, and we help governments do this quite a bit. Another big need in the world is to establish baselines of public exposure to understand how much lead is in the blood of an average citizen or an average child, because it may be that two adjacent countries have very different profiles in terms of their exposures to lead. And this will help a country identify how much of a priority it is to address this issue. And then the third piece of understanding the problem is to differentiate the sources of lead pollution within a municipality or a province or a country. This is through a process called source apportionment, where basically you survey an environment, say a town, and understand, okay, is lead coming from battery recycling? What percentage of exposures is coming from food and spices? What percentage from cookware? What percentage from contaminated water? So this is an activity, before you design an intervention, you really want to understand the sources so that you don't spend your time and money addressing a source that's really not a priority in a given community. Then, of course, a big challenge is preventing current ongoing pollution and preventing future pollution from happening. And there's a couple of tools that we and others use to do that. The first is providing technical assistance to recyclers. This can be to formal sector recyclers that are licensed or informal. But fundamentally, a lot of these recyclers don't mean to do any harm. They simply don't have a lot of capital at hand and don't have high technical expertise in the industry that they're involved with. So a little bit of technical assistance around designing cost-effective pollution controls can go a long way. The other issue that I touched on briefly is that regulators simply aren't that familiar with this issue. I was in the state of Bihar, India, meeting with the director of pollution control there, and I was asking him, do you have staff members that are in charge of this industry? And he told me, frankly, we regulate hundreds of industries, and my staff has never received training on this. If they walked into a battery recycling plant, they really would have no idea if it was clean or dirty or how to improve it. Because it's just not part of their education. So training regulators to identify and understand this issue is a big part of the solution here. And then finally, one of the big challenges with the battery issue is keeping batteries that are used and no longer hold a charge out of the informal recycling economy. So after a battery is manufactured, sold to a retailer, sold to the consumer uses it, it's then old and they need to return it. The consumer doesn't care that much who takes it from there. They just need a new battery. But from that point, a battery can go in two directions. It can go to a formal sector recycler who will hopefully recycle it cleanly and safely, or it can be diverted into the informal economy or the black market, where it's very often recycled in a backyard with the type of crude processes that Rich mentioned already. And so this requires kind of policy and market-based solutions to create incentives to keep batteries in the formal supply chain so they don't get into that black market. And then finally, of course, there is existing pollution all over the world. And this simply needs to be cleaned up. But fortunately, unlike many other chemicals, lead cleanup projects are fairly inexpensive. They're comparatively easy and pretty fast. And we use 7 basic steps when doing this. We make sure that whatever pollution source at a contaminated site has stopped. We assess the soil and dust around that area. We measure the blood level in the lead level in children's blood. We educate the community about the risks and why we're here and what we plan to do. And then we cap contaminated soils with clean soil or concrete or bricks. Fundamentally, lead started in the ground, and if it goes back underground, people won't be exposed to it. And that is a method used by the EPA and accepted around the world, and that's what we do. And then finally, we clean the inside of homes so children aren't touching contaminated dust and putting it in their mouths. And then finally, assess the environment and the blood of children again to make sure that in fact we've cleaned everything up and people aren't exposed anymore. 2 quick examples of this. We've replicated this model around the world, including a project recently in Vietnam, where we use this capping technology. That's what these people are doing in the photograph. At the start of the project, you can see that the average, in the chart below, the average child had a level of lead in their blood of 40 micrograms per deciliter. And if you're not familiar with that unit, it just means that they have 8 times what would be a level in the US that would trigger the government to intervene in their life. The post-project evaluation of blood showed that the average had dropped to 13, so much closer to what we would accept in the West, essentially. Very similar project in Bangladesh completed last year. You can see, again, these folks are scraping contaminated soil. That soil was then buried. That area was covered with clean soil, and similar reductions in the levels of lead in the children's blood there. So cookware, we mentioned as a source in lower income countries. And there's really 2 types that drive exposures here. As Rich mentioned, it's ceramic cookware made with leaded glazes. This is a big issue in Mexico in particular, where 20% of the population has high levels of lead in their blood, primarily from lead leaching out of this cookware. And the real problem here is that the lead will leach out when it is mixed with acidic foodstuffs. And of course, that's fairly common in Mexican cooking. And so this is a big problem in Mexico. But it's not confined to Mexico. It's also in Central Asia, East Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And there's a second type of cookware that also leads to exposures, and that's very inexpensive, what are billed as aluminum pots, but are in fact mixed recycled metals that include lead. And again, this leaches out when heat is applied to it and goes into the food and thus into the body. So what do we do about these things? Well, we've been engaged in Mexico for about a decade using kind of a standard protocol to address the glaze issue, the leaded glaze issue. And fundamentally, it's identify producers that use this, educate them about the risks, help them switch to very appropriate and good-looking lead-free glazes, then help them advertise that they are lead-free so they have a competitive advantage against those people that still use lead glaze, help them clean up their workshops, coordinate with the regulators that are enforcing lead-free glazes, and then help drive public demand for lead-free pottery by educating the public that there's really 2 types of pottery out there. You can choose one that will poison your child or one that won't. And then finally helping stores and restaurants and hotels advertise on their storefronts that everything in this commercial space is lead-free. That again helps educate the public and drive demand. And I just want to conclude by saying, you know, the tragedy of lead is that when children are poisoned, it really steals their potential to have their intellectual potential and their potential to lead a really productive life. And the good news is it's very solvable. We understand lead well. The economic return on investment is really high because of the lost productivity from IQ loss. there aren't many industries involved, so we don't have to reorder our whole economy or wait for some great new technology. The cleanups are fairly simple. And finally, there's a growing coalition of people that are aware of this and ready to work on preventing future pollution. So the iron is hot and the time to strike on lead is now. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lara Crampe, and I'm going to talk today about our locally based solutions to address and prevent mercury pollution. So a major source of mercury pollution worldwide is small-scale gold mining. And an important point here is that it's called small-scale because it's happening at the individual level. It's small cooperatives, it's individual people, but it's not a small impact. It's 15 million people that we're talking about, 15 to 25% of the gold that we're using in our jewelry and in other forms. And so it's a small scale operation, but it's really a global, huge impact. So how is mercury involved in this? In most cases, we're seeing this in small scale gold mining because the gold is locked up in rocks. They have to get this small amounts of gold, small flecks of gold out of really hard rocks. And so they're pulverizing it. In the first picture there, they're using a machine to really pulverize it into dust. The second machine is a ball mill where they would put those rocks into this metal drum with steel balls that would again create this sort of pulverized mixture of dust and rock and gold all mixed together. And then they'll add water to that and make sort of a slurry, a very liquidy cement kind of mixture. And so the third picture is where they would put that slurry into the top container and then run it down kind of a gutter that would be lined with carpet or felt or some kind of material, so that as that material, that sludge is running over it, the gold, which is heavier, will fall to the bottom and be collected in that then they can wash off and sort of have a more concentrated material. Once they have that, well, the picture here at the bottom with all these people standing, that's another method where they're actually using boulders to sort of mash that slurry together with mercury. Or in the next picture with the panning, they'll actually have mercury mixed in with gold and sand and other materials so that it can combine. It creates this amalgam, so the mercury will actually draw that gold out of the sand and other material that's in there to help in this sort of concentration process. And at any one of these steps, mercury can be added, and so the pollution can happen in many different ways. It either comes out in wastewater, it comes out in leftover material that does not have the gold in it that's then left on the site, or as in that final picture there, it's in the burning process. So then when they have this amalgam of mercury and gold, they'll burn it off, and that leaves only the gold, and the mercury has then evaporated off into the air, which then gets into our food environment. So what can we do about it? We need to address this at the source. We need to go into these communities where this mercury use is happening and do education programs and really figure out how we can address it in the same ways that Drew was talking about with lead. We need to clean up areas that have already been polluted, and we need to prevent future pollution. So one very successful way that we've found is by doing miner to miner training. In this picture, the man in the black jacket is Leoncio. He's a miner from the Philippines who works with a cooperative that has successfully gone mercury free, and he's training a group of Mongolian miners to go mercury free as well. So it's a panning technique that they can use that allows them to concentrate the gold without using mercury. And in this project, he trained 1,000 miners who were then trained as trainers so they can train other miners, other women that are working in similar situations. Another solution that we found is to look ecologically at solutions. So one of the reasons that these small scale miners are operating with such difficult to access gold is that they're going into areas where a gold mine has already operated and left. And so one way to prevent that from happening is to close mines effectively. So with a reforestation project, we've used this as a way to close off mining sites to really discourage people from going back there, and also because plants and good ground cover can also sequester mercury and prevent that mercury from running into the rivers. So in Peru, we did this project with a local partner where we were able to plant 4,800 trees and different sort of complementary plantings that will reseed the rainforest so that it really turns these desertified areas back into an ecologically sound environment that can help keep the mercury in. And so in that project, actually the government took that as a pilot and then expanded that work. So now they've put money forward to address this type of desertification that's happened in their rainforests. To get a sense of the scale, 168,000 acres have been destroyed in the last 20 years in Peru along the rainforest, and because of mining. And so this project was addressing the first 8 of those acres. And so we're hoping to continue to do that. Another solution we found is to work within the systems that are already existing. So in this community, for example, in Indonesia, the miners weren't burning the mercury themselves. They were taking that amalgam of gold and mercury to the gold shop, and the gold shop was burning it. So we introduced technology locally that could be built in the local community, and then trainers that were trained in the local community to work with gold shops to show them how to collect the mercury, to use these machines so that when they're burning that mercury amalgam, it's not exposing them and their local communities, and it's also not just being released into the air. So they're able to collect that mercury. And then finally, introducing economic incentives locally. So this is a project in Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian part of Borneo, working with women miners. And in this example, they're actually doing alluvial mining. So they're panning in the bottom of a river. If they add mercury in this step, it will just wash directly into the river, directly into our oceans. So it was really important for us to find ways that we could introduce mercury-free techniques. And one way that was really successful was to connect them to a jewelry market that was willing to offer a premium for mercury-free gold. So these women now get 20% more for their gold through a jeweler in Bali by staying mercury-free. So that's been a really successful project there, and we're working with a local community development organization to continue that work. And the local government was so excited about that we're able to then also work with a regional project to do action planning about other pollution issues that are happening in their region so that we can continue to address that. And essentially, we're able to look at all these solutions in more of a community-focused way, because even though the mercury is affecting us globally, it's really a local community-based solution that we need. And so we've tried all of these different aspects, and it's been a way that we've been able to partner in the local community, but then have a global impact. And I'm happy to answer more questions about this when we're done, but I want to turn it over to my colleague Judith, who's going to talk about health and pollution action plans.
Thanks, Lara. My name is Judith Sanford. I'm the Regional Director for Africa. So I'm going to quickly talk about the Health and Pollution Action Plan. Given the work that we do and the experience that we've been able to accumulate, doing the kind of work, we realize that a lot of government leaders are not aware of the scope of pollution's impact on their nation. For instance, the burden of disease, economic losses, and healthcare costs. So what we have done to help them find solutions, we have initiated the Health and Pollution Action Plan, which is supported by USAID, Oak Foundation, private donors. So what we do with this, it's a process that really engage government. We work with several country ministries, including Ministry of Health, Environment, Industry, Finance, Transport. And also we engage international partners such as UN agencies, UNEP, UNICEF, WHO, and UNDP, and as well as the private sector. So what we did in Madagascar, the solution is the health and pollution action plan. So what we do is we, through a series of workshops, we bring the government together to prioritize existing pollution issues. And in Madagascar, a working group was created from seven different ministries, members from 7 different ministries. So, and a work plan was developed, which is being adopted by the government. It's a roadmap to help the government deal with its pollution challenges. And during that process, 3 things were prioritized. 3 main issues: outdoor air pollution, household air pollution, exposure to toxic sites. Outdoor air pollution mainly caused by toxic exhaust of like old cars. A lot of old cars that we would never use here is being used, you know, in Madagascar, not just Madagascar, but throughout the continent of Africa or many poor countries. And household air pollution is caused by people use wood or charcoal for cooking. So this is done indoors, and you can see that people are breathing this. And also exposure to toxic sites, which is mainly caused by industrial waste, which Richard, you know, covered a lot earlier on. Results to date, based on the process that we used in Madagascar's Ministry of Health has in his plan to install about 30 pollution monitors throughout the country, which is really new. And this is as a result of the work that we have done, engaging government and bringing them to the table to discuss and prioritize the health issues. We have several international partners committed to finding solution. And back in July 2019, we had a meeting we co-hosted a meeting with UNICEF, and 66 attendees participated, 34 public and private organization businesses were part of the meeting, and there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm to continue the discussion in finding long-term solutions to the problem. And we have also engaged some great international partners, USAID. And lastly, I just want to say that we developed a partnership with MacArthur Foundation. We submitted a proposal with to the MacArthur Foundation in a consortium with Indiana University. And the work that has done in Madagascar has attracted the attention of like several media outlets. So the word is getting out there that the government is on board and is dedicated to dealing with the pollution issue in Madagascar. And the HPOP process has been completed in several countries already: Madagascar, Thailand, Colombia, Ghana, Kyrgyzstan, Philippines, Tanzania. And right now, the process is underway in Bangladesh, Senegal, Indonesia, and India. And so this is all we have for you today. And if you have questions, we will be available here to answer them.
Jamie, back to you.
Oops.
You there?
I'm here. I'm just trying to start my video again. There we go. Hi, sorry. Thank you all for thought-provoking presentations. I know that there's a lot more information that you weren't able to share today, and I'm sure we have questions from our participants. I've already received one via the chat function about finding out how cooking pots contain lead. And before we move into that question, I just want to encourage everybody who is virtually participating, if you want to ask a question and you can't, if I've force muted you and you can't unmute your phone or your screen, just let me know via chat or raise your hand using the raise hand function. And then I'll just go ahead and ask the New York in-person participants to funnel, kind of to have one of the staff people in that room tell me if anybody has a question, because I can only see Richard right now. I can't see any of you. And we'll go ahead and take turns. So I'm going to start with this question from our virtual participants about finding out if cooking pots contain lead. And then we'll move into a in-person participant question.
So let me have a go at this, but Drew, if you unmute and can fill in for me as well. First of all, if you're buying high quality cookware from any of the big outlets here in the US, these are not likely to be places where you'll find lead in your cooking pots. This is only the really cheap stuff you'll find in the poorest markets of the world that have this kind of stuff, made from recycled metals and all the rest of it. So it's not going to be the stuff that's in my house. I've actually checked pretty much every pot and pan over the years, and it just doesn't exist. If you've got something that you brought back, as a tourist and found something beautiful that you liked, there are these little devices you can buy online called lead checks. And lead checks are they look like little cigarettes, but you break them, and there's two liquids inside that when you break the glass and shake it, you end up with this stuff that when you squeeze it onto the material you're checking, if it goes red, then you've got lead in there above 600 parts per million. And then you know that it's dangerous. So the lead check devices, they're easy to find on Amazon. Drew, what else am I missing here?
No, I think you've got it. And where we do find exposures in the US from ceramics or spices, it's typically when people have brought something back from abroad. So to reiterate your point, purchasing things in the US, ceramics or spices, is generally safe.
Are there any questions in the room?
Anna, would you like to answer?
Sure.
Yeah. We have one from Anna in the room. Go ahead.
Sure. I was just curious to know, going back to the gold miners in Asia female gold miners who were able to sell at a higher 20% premium.
Right.
What triggered the government to get excited about that and bring in more help? Like, what specific aspect of that? Like, what triggered their interest to ask for more help?
Could everyone hear that question?
Not at all. Could you repeat it, please?
Okay.
So the question is, when a higher rate was offered to a group of women in Kalimantan, what triggered the government to enable that to happen? This is for gold. Is that correct, Anna? So let me pass that over to Lara to answer, because it's a fabulous question.
Yeah, well, the government got excited about getting involved in our action planning process because they are also part of another initiative we have called the Global Alliance of Health and Pollution. So they had heard about these action plans before. Once we started working with the local community development organization and were able to do this mine to market project with the women, that's when they were able to say, oh, well, we really want to do this HPOP process here. So it was sort of a connection between the things I was presenting and what Judith was presenting, that really seeing it in action was a way that the government saw the value of addressing this pollution and that there are solutions out there. And this is one example. What other ways are we being affected by pollution that we could potentially have these solutions for as well? So that's why we started doing the health and pollution action plan with the government there.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Ali Carlson's phone. She has a question with some details that I'm going to let her explain. Ali, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Very
can.
well.
Yes. Hi, Richard. I just wanted to quick tag onto your last answer. Those lead check tests available online. My real concern about those is that the commercial test for consumers uses a 600 parts per million threshold, below which they call it lead free, which is baloney, because we all know that levels much lower are a danger.
Yes. If we start to dive into the science of this, you actually need to do a toxic leach check and do a study to determine if the lead actually becomes bioavailable, if it would leach out of the pot and into food. That's a much more long, complicated process. And that can happen even at very low levels from a lead check. So really the lead check is only a kind of a first line to actually see if something's a problem. And you have to go through a full TCLP to see whether you actually do have a health risk. The other thing too that comes into here that makes it more complex is, you know, if you eat from something once a year compared to eating from something 3 times a day, then the results much more significant. So there's a lot in there. So I think, you know, if you've got something that you've brought back from overseas that you think may be associated with high levels of lead, probably the best thing to do is give us a call.
Yeah, thanks. And we got to get to more source problems than worrying about first world people testing their gifts from Mexico.
Yeah. Don't eat from them. That's the main thing. I don't.
There's another question from in-room participants.
There's one from Catherine here. I'll repeat it, yeah.
Basically, to follow up on that scientific, could you help describe to the community like your huge scientific network of people that you work with in country and abroad?
Right. So Catherine's asking about the network of science advisors that we work with. And it's true, we have a really large technical advisory board that has members from, not just from US and Europe, but throughout the global South as well. And we use these folk in a range of different ways. They're there as basic support analysis to be able to answer exactly the sort of question that just came up about POTS and the rest of it. But more important, they go out usually without pay, just with their expenses covered, to projects in low and middle income countries and take the lead in the technology transfer, in training and all the rest of it, in these places where toxins are really, really high levels. So that's a terrific group. It meets regularly and grows as time goes on with more and more people joining it. A lot of environmental engineers, but other sorts of toxic specialists as well are part of that group. Jamie, what else have you got there?
I'm going to let Raymond ask his question next.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. It is 10 p.m. here in Uganda, so we are going to sleep. Can you listen to me?
Go ahead, Raymond, nicely. I can hear you well.
Yeah, it is 10 p.m. here in Uganda, so you're feeling sleepy, but I have to be awake to listen to this.
You're a good man.
Yeah, good to hear the talk from Richard and the team, and I thank all you for that. One, can we access the lead check in Africa? Where can we, as I said, from Uganda, I work with Uganda, and I connect the network partners working with people in Africa. In Uganda, we have oil. In western part of Uganda, and I talk about mercury. We cannot run off from batteries because what we have in Uganda. So what can we do to address that? Since we don't have any solution for the cars that we have, of course I was in US and I see these, and Europe, these new technologies of cars, but in Africa it's different. We have the cars, we use the mercury batteries. So what else can we do other than that? Secondly, is about, I'm interested in the science-based advocacy, which I think that is very key. So what can we do? Actually, we need the pure earth in Uganda, especially in looking at the environment and oil and gas. So I think we can, how do we engage partners together, especially leading to the private sector engagement, investment in this. Thank you.
Thanks, Raymond. Thank you very much for calling in from miles away at 10 o'clock at night. That's really great. You know, there's a lot that can happen there, but again, when we look at where we're able to focus both with the health and pollution action plans and with in-country activities, you know, our budgets don't stretch too far at the moment. We're looking to try and expand, and given your interest and concern there, you know, we'll look to see if we can get some involvement and bring some of this technical expertise out there. I can't, promise too much there, but the Global Alliance, of course, is the right starting point for there, and being a part of the Global Alliance, I think, is the critical first step. But let's just be in touch and keep talking and see what we can do. See if we can find some resources to help out.
Any more questions in the room?
he didn't answer the lead check. Can we get it in Uganda?
I don't know, but let me go and find out. Send an email and we'll go and find out and see what we can do.
I have some questions from online participants, but I want to give a chance for in-person participants to ask.
Anyone else in the room have a question? I think we're okay for going to online now.
Okay. So the next question I have is, how does mercury exposure in small scale gold compare to mercury exposure in fish from coal production?
Good question. So mercury moves, it's very motile. It will move through soil, air and soil. It has, as you can tell, it's a liquid at room temperature, but it also will vaporize very, very easily. And because it will vaporize, it can move into water and then ends up bioaccumulating in fish and ends up in the pelagic fish that end up in our sushi. Mercury exposures being released anywhere in the world will end up at some point coming back and affecting us here in the West. When the global releases of mercury are currently being evaluated, the largest single source of mercury emissions now is from this small-scale gold mining. And it's now larger than the emissions from coal-fired power plants. I was really thrilled to be in China for the World Economic Forum and talk to a lot of the Chinese authorities. They are building a lot of coal-fired power plants, but they've all got mercury scrubbers on them. So they're very keen to avoid both sulfur and mercury emissions in those coal-fired power plants. So overall, there's been a lot of attention to reducing mercury emissions from coal. Meanwhile, the gold rush continues in dozens of countries around the world. And this method of using mercury is the basic, simplest starting way of getting mercury out of the ground. So it seems to be growing. It's only in places where some education has been brought in that the mercury alternate technologies come to bear. So it's the number one risk for mercury these days.
I want to point out that it's 3:07. I think we have time for one more question, which I have online if there's nothing in the room. And then we probably have to wrap up and say goodbye, Richard. So I'll ask this last question unless you have someone in the room who wants to ask something.
Go right ahead.
The last question is actually about the impact on these toxic metals and wildlife as opposed to human impact. And if you have any information or research on that, toxic metal pollution and impact on wildlife.
Yes, there is significant biological impact from exposure to metals in different parts of the biosphere. It varies according to what kind of toxin there is and what kind of part of the biosphere is impacted. In Russia, they're very concerned about lead exposure amongst tigers, for example. So there are studies that show up for mercury exposure among some of the larger porpoise populations as well. But in general, this particular set of data is not nearly as well developed as it is for the human population. But clearly, anything that's damaging brains is going to impact not just human brains, but any neurological system that's out there. And that seems to be where most of these heavy metals really have their majority impact. Brains are ubiquitous.
It is 3:08, and I think if you have some closing remarks, Richard, that would be wonderful to hear, giving us some hope and closing up the webinar.
Yeah, so I would like to point out that this looks like an overwhelming problem. You look at these numbers and think, oh my God, how are we going to do something about this? But we don't see it like that here in our organization. We see this as kind of a lot of small, steady steps ends up solving the problem. And, there are models where we've seen this work already happened, not just in the West, where really the problem has, for the most part, been pretty well dealt with. but even in different countries, there is great strides that end up happening. You know, Vietnam has taken this lead issue and is now taking it to scale throughout the whole country. There's great success in mercury reductions in quite a few countries. It's just these slow, steady activities that seem to be getting there. So I see this as, you know, if we work hard on this for the next 40 or 50 years, and we'll reduce 80% of the problem. That's how I look at it. And without spending hundreds of billions of dollars, just some billions of dollars. And those who are interested, on the screen there, Carol is pointing out her name and phone number to be in touch with. Obviously, please reach out to any of us if we can provide you more information and more data about all of this.
Well, thank you to Richard and all the presenters today for this information, for all of the work that you don't see that goes into creating the summary you create in a PowerPoint slide. I know that's years of work, that's travel, that's research, and it's appreciated by many people. I want to thank our other partner organization, HEFN, for encouraging their members to join this webinar, and it's been a delight to have this partnership, so we thank you all. We'll be sending out a link to a recording of the webinar in a few days in case you want to revisit any of the information. Please note Carol's email address on the screen in case you have any questions that didn't get answered today that you want to reach out and ask directly to the Pure Earth team. And thank you all, and have a nice rest of your day and a good week.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Till soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I know.